October 1944. The Pacific Ocean churned with a quiet violence. Thousands of miles of water stretched endlessly, a dark, endless mirror hiding the ghosts of war beneath its surface. The tide of World War II had begun to turn. The Japanese Empire, once unstoppable, was bleeding territory island by island. The Americans were advancing, relentless, methodical, but victory was far from guaranteed. The next great battle would take place in the Philippines, and it would decide who controlled the Pacific. This was Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. But inside that chaos, one small corner of the ocean, a thin patch of water off the coast of Samar, would become the stage for one of the most unbelievable acts of courage ever recorded. There, a handful of American ships, tiny destroyers, outmatched in every way, would face the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was a fight that should have lasted minutes. It became a legend that still echoes through time. The Japanese plan was bold, desperate even. Their empire was cornered. Fuel was running low, ships were scarce, and the once proud combined fleet was fractured. But they still had one weapon left: deception. While one force would lure the American fleet away with decoy carriers, the main Japanese battle group, loaded with battleships and cruisers, would sneak through a narrow strait and fall upon the vulnerable American invasion forces at Leyte. Leading that force was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a veteran, calm and calculating. His flagship, the Yamato, was the largest battleship ever built, bristling with 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the size of cars across the horizon. Kurita commanded a storm of steel, 23 battleships and cruisers, over 60 destroyers, a floating fortress of firepower, and standing in his way was a handful of American escort ships, Task Unit 77.4.3. They called themselves Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was never meant for direct combat. Its job was to support ground troops, to protect the invasion beaches, provide air cover and fend off submarines. Their ships were small, thin-skinned escort carriers, destroyers and destroyer escorts. The sailors aboard them were young, some barely 20, and many had never seen a full-scale sea battle before. Their leader was Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, known as Ziggy. He was brave, steady and sharp, but he had no idea that within hours he'd be fighting one of the greatest battles in naval history, completely outnumbered, completely unprepared, and completely alone. At dawn on October 25, 1944, the sea was calm. Taffy 3's pilots launched early morning patrols, the horizon glowed orange, and for a few peaceful minutes the war felt distant, like a bad dream. Then at 6:37 a.m., radar screens flared to life. Dozens of blips appeared where there should have been none. The communications officer called out the impossible: multiple contacts, bearing northwest, large formation, closing fast. Through binoculars, sailors saw what looked like a dark wall rising from the mist. The sun caught the glint of steel, turrets, gun barrels, and silhouettes far too massive to be destroyers. Someone whispered, almost disbelieving, Those are battleships." And then the truth hit them. The entire Japanese center force had broken through. The Yamato, the Nagato, and a swarm of cruisers and destroyers were charging straight for them. Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts had just run headlong into the core of the Japanese Navy. The Japanese fleet opened fire first. 32 miles away, the battleship Yamato spoke, its guns roaring like thunder rolling over the horizon. Shells, the weight of small cars, rose into the clouds, vanished, and then screamed down through the morning air. Water erupted around the American carriers, towering white columns, each one a heartbeat away from annihilation. Every sailor on those decks knew that if one shell landed true, the ship would be gone, and with it, hundreds of men. Admiral Sprague's voice cut through the panic. "Turn east, full speed, launch everything we've got." Engines screamed. The tiny escort carriers heaved into sharp turns, their decks tilting under the strain. Pilots ran for their planes. Some were still armed with depth charges for submarines, utterly useless against battleships, but there was no time to rearm. At 6:56 a.m., the first Avenger torpedo bomber rolled down the deck of white planes and clawed into the sky. Within minutes, dozens followed. Fighters, torpedo planes, dive bombers, every aircraft that could still fly. They climbed into the storm, knowing exactly what they were flying into. Down below, the destroyers took their own orders. Johnston, Hull, Heermann. 3 grey streaks accelerating toward the enemy. Commander Ernest E. Evans of the Johnston didn't hesitate. All engines ahead flank, smoke screen, prepare torpedoes. Evans was half Cherokee, half Scots-Irish, and completely fearless. His crew said he fought like a man who had already accepted death. He grinned through the bridge window and shouted, "We're going in, give 'em hell." The Johnston disappeared into her own wall of smoke, charging head-on at ships 10 times her size. From the air, pilots could see the hopelessness of it. A handful of grey specks carving white wakes against a formation that stretched to the horizon. But something unexpected began to happen. The Japanese guns couldn't find their range. The destroyers' smoke and frantic maneuvers threw off the gunners' aim. Shells landed everywhere, but not on them. Then at 7:10 a.m., Johnston fired. 10 torpedoes left her tubes, streaking across the sea like silver knives. Moments later, a column of fire erupted from the heavy cruiser Kumano. One hit, massive explosion, its bow torn open, the ship dead in the water. For a heartbeat, disbelief swept through both sides. A tiny American destroyer had just crippled a Japanese cruiser. Evans wheeled his ship back into the smoke, already bleeding from near misses, already shouting for more shells. The men around him were no longer scared. They were furious. Meanwhile, the sky above turned into chaos. American planes dove through anti-aircraft fire so dense it looked like black rain. They dropped torpedoes, bombs, even empty fuel tanks when the ammo ran out. Each pass cost lives, but each attack slowed the Japanese line a little more. By 8 a.m., the sea between the two fleets was a living hell. Smoke, fire, splintered wood, and the smell of oil burning on the waves. Hull and Heermann followed Johnston's lead, launching torpedoes at point-blank range, weaving between geysers of water taller than buildings. Every sailor knew the math. Sooner or later, the Japanese would find their mark. At 8:15 a.m., Johnston took a direct hit. Shells tore through her bridge and engines. Evans was wounded, his shirt soaked in blood. But the ship kept fighting, guns still hammering, crew still shouting orders through smoke and pain. Nearby, the carrier Gambia Bay caught a shell through her hull. She slowed, listing, burning, men jumping into the oil-slick sea. Admiral Sprague radioed for help, but there was none. Taffy 2 and Taffy 1 were too far away. The main fleet was chasing decoys hundreds of miles to the north. It was just them. A handful of destroyers and escort carriers holding back an armada. By mid-morning, the Pacific looked like it had been clawed open. Columns of smoke rose miles high. The horizon glowed orange and black. Radio chatter had dissolved into static and half-shouted fragments. Orders, prayers, screams. Every ship in Taffy 3 was fighting alone, yet somehow they were fighting together. Sprague's carriers ran east, zigzagging through curtains of smoke, launching every plane that still had fuel. A deck officer on Kalinin Bay described it later. It was like swatting a bear with a stick and realizing the bear was backing away. Because the impossible was happening, each destroyer's suicidal charge had confused Kurita's formation. The Japanese admiral saw torpedo wakes where there were none. His cruisers were colliding, scattering to avoid phantom attacks. He believed he'd stumbled into the main American fleet. He thought he was facing dozens of carriers, not 6 fragile ones. The destroyer Heermann danced between 2 battleships, firing until her magazines ran dry. The hull went down fighting, engines dead, deck aflame, guns still blazing until seawater swallowed her fire. Out of her 300 men, barely a handful would live to see another sunrise. They died believing the carriers behind them might escape, and they were right. At 9:20 a.m., the first wave of returning American planes struck again. Some carried no torpedoes, only machine guns and courage. They dove low, strafing decks, dropping depth charges on cruisers simply to keep them turning. A single 500-pound bomb from an Avenger tore through the heavy cruiser Chikuma. Smoke poured from her engines, her rudder jammed. Minutes later, another bomb hit Chokai. 2 of Kurita's strongest ships were now burning wrecks. Kurita watched from Yamato's bridge, the world's largest battleship surrounded by chaos. He had come expecting an easy slaughter. Instead, he saw confusion and ruin. Every instinct told him to press forward, to crush the Americans and claim victory. But doubt had crept in. If these were mere escort ships, why were they fighting like an entire fleet? And where were the American fast battleships that should have been guarding the carriers? At 9:45 a.m., he gave the order no one expected. Turn the fleet. Withdraw. On the American side, no one realized it at first. They were still firing, still bleeding, still bracing for the next wave. Then lookouts noticed something strange. The enemy ships were turning away. The thunder of their guns faded into the mist. By 10 o'clock, the ocean that had been hell itself was suddenly quiet. Just the hiss of burning oil and the sound of men calling for help from the water. Sprague's staff refused to believe it. "They're retreating," a young officer whispered. Sprague nodded once, too tired to speak. They had held. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts had faced the heart of the Japanese Navy and lived. The cost was brutal. Gambier Bay, Howell, Samuel B. Roberts, and Johnston were gone. Hundreds of sailors drifted for days before rescue, surrounded by oil, sharks, and silence. Commander Ernest Evans was never found. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive it. His citation ended with the words, "He fought his ship until she could fight no more." The Japanese lost 4 heavy cruisers and, more importantly, their will to fight another major sea battle. The Imperial Navy, once feared across the Pacific, never again sailed in force. That morning off Samar became the moment the ocean changed sides. Years later, survivors would describe it not as victory, but as defiance. A young gunner from White Plains said, "We were supposed to die out there. But we didn't. We just kept shooting." Historians would call it the greatest mismatch in naval history. Sailors would call it a miracle. And when the sun sets over the Philippine Sea, the water still hides their wrecks, silent, resting in the deep. Tiny destroyers that faced monsters and made them turn away. The night the Japanese Navy disappeared,